this edition of Street Stories,
I don't have that long to live.
he's a hemophiliac, but that's not all.
I've got AIDS.
And thousands of hemophiliacs like him are dying.
This was just a tragic failure of the entire medical system in the country.
Many charge it didn't have to happen.
I would probably have to blame the Factor VIII producers because I think they were forewarned.
Good evening and welcome to Street Stories. I'm Ed Bradley. Tonight, the story of a tragedy that some say should never have happened, one that has cost thousands of lives. It's the story of hemophiliacs with AIDS. The epidemic has struck this group with overwhelming force. Nearly all hemophiliacs born before 1985 have been infected with the AIDS virus, doomed by the very same treatment designed to help them. And now, as Richard Roth reports, some are charging those who made the medicine knew it could be deadly long before they did anything about it.
You were a hemophiliac.
I'm a hemophiliac. And I found out in 1985 that I was HIV positive.
And now?
Now I've got AIDS.
Tom Taylor is 47. He's married and a father, and before he got sick, he worked in Northern California as an electrical engineer.
What do the doctors tell you?
The doctors, there's not too much to say. I don't have that long to live.
As a hemophiliac, Taylor was born without the proteins that enable blood to clot. The treatment for his hemophilia is what gave him AIDS.
I became HIV infected through the use of Factor VIII blood products, which is what I have to take when I have a bleed, being a hemophiliac.
This is Factor VIII.
I hate this.
And it is what infected Loras Goedken with HIV as well.
You ready?
Oh, I'm ready.
Dick?
The medicine is a concentrate made by mixing blood from many donors.
Each vial of Factor VIII that I take, I'm exposed to anywhere between 8 and 20,000 different blood donors.
That put hemophiliacs at enormous risk.
It's warm in here.
In the early years of the AIDS crisis, before blood was screened, 10,000 men, 9 out of 10 hemophiliacs who took Factor VIII regularly, were infected.
Every time I get an infusion, I'm tired of being a hemophiliac. Every time I have to go in for a blood test, I'm tired of being HIV positive. But you got to go on.
Goedken is from a large Iowa farm family.
Mother had to write all the names down so she wouldn't forget us. Is that true? Here we all are.
6 of Mary Goedken's 7 sons were born with hemophilia.
And then Ernie, and then Jay.
For much of their lives, the boys depended on transfusions of whole blood or plasma to stop severe bleeds. In the early 70s, Factor VIII changed everything. An infusion only took 10 or 20 minutes, and it could be done at home.
Who was the first to die?
From HIV, my brother Ernie, he was 47.
And then?
And then my nephew, Clayton, at 4.5 months old. And then Carl died. Then Clayton's father, Denny. And then Jan, my wife, in April of 90. And then Clayton's mother. And then Jay died in August of 91.
It's a tragedy shared by a whole generation of hemophiliacs. Men who discovered the wonderful treatment that changed their lives was actually killing them.
Basically, I'd like to know how I got where I am today and who's responsible for that.
Tom Taylor believes that many hemophiliacs could have been saved.
This is a petition calling for a congressional investigation.
So does Loras Goedken. They're among a growing number of hemophiliacs who want to know more.
Federal health officials consider it an epidemic, yet you rarely hear a thing about it.
It was in July of 1982 that government researchers announced the first 3 cases of hemophiliacs with a mysterious disease called AIDS.
Blood transfusions.
Hemophiliacs now want to know why it wasn't until the end of 1983, almost a year and a half later, that anyone decided to warn them of concern that AIDS was being passed along in the medicine they were taking.
If I had to point a finger, I would probably have to blame the Factor VIII producers.
Because?
Because I think they were forewarned and that they didn't take the necessary precautions. And I think they were forewarned early enough to prevent a lot of us from getting HIV.
What was done at the time was the most that could be done with the knowledge of the time, and that this tragedy simply couldn't have been prevented.
Attorney Duncan Barr has defended Cutter Labs, a company that makes Factor VIII, in 9 lawsuits brought by Haemophiliacs.
I don't think that anybody at Cutter, and I'm rather certain anybody at the FDA, felt in the year we're talking about, late 82, 1983, that this disease was transmitted by blood. It was a possibility, and everyone acted on that possibility.
Dr. Donald Francis disagrees.
Our hypothesis, at least, was that we had a blood-borne infection really by early 1982, mid-1982, certainly.
At the time, Francis was an epidemiologist at the Federal Centers for Disease Control, the CDC.
Investigating the cases of
Francis says that in December 1982, the CDC announced that an infant had died of AIDS after getting a blood transfusion from a man who also had the disease. According to Francis, the CDC thought the evidence clinched the theory that AIDS was transmitted through blood.
Can't you say that the CDC at that point was telling the people who were making Factor VIII and the people who were collecting blood that the blood was carrying this disease that was fatal?
Yes.
But they didn't tell anybody.
No, there was a resistance to the whole concept. Leaders in the decision-making process in the blood bank industry were saying that this is inconclusive, that there's no proof, and that if there is this problem, it's an extremely low risk.
The memo from Cutter's general counsel.
In fact, just days after the CDC linked the death of the baby to tainted blood, a lawyer at Cutter Labs wrote an internal memo urging printed warnings in every package of Factor VIII. That didn't happen.
Why wasn't anything done?
At the time, I don't think anything was done personally because I don't think there was enough medical or scientific information to quantify what the risk was.
But in January 1983, the CDC called a blood industry meeting in Atlanta to emphasize its concern. Present at the meeting, people from the 4 major suppliers of Factor VIII: Highland Therapeutics, Alpha Therapeutics, Armor Pharmaceutical, and Cutter.
We laid out the problem, the size of the problem, and the solution to the problem.
According to notes made by a Cutter official, the CDC doctors said they were convinced the disease was transmitted through blood and blood products such as Factor VIII.
The reaction, especially from the blood collecting institutions, was very negative. That they were saying CDC was blowing the whistle far too early.
Manufacturers did not tell people taking Factor VIII of the risk that AIDS was in the blood supply. But they did begin using questionnaires to screen out high-risk donors. Gay men, Haitians, and IV drug users selling their blood were asked to identify themselves voluntarily. They even posted signs in blood centers.
The warning or the notice that was posted in blood collection centers: AIDS is a disease that may be transmissible through plasma products. Now, this is a warning that's being given those who are donating blood.
Correct.
But it's not a warning that Cutter is passing on to those who are receiving the donated blood product.
Sure, and there's a huge difference that I think is kind of obvious. People coming in to donate plasma, all we had to do is say to them, there's a possibility that maybe if you're in this category, you might have this disease, and therefore you can't donate. Goodbye, go away. That's a huge difference between saying to someone whose life depends upon this medicine, maybe, possibly, by chance, perhaps, this disease might be transmitted by blood products, but we have no idea whether that's true, and we don't know any more information that we can give to you, and we can't quantify it.
Tom Taylor told us he believes the companies were protecting themselves, not him.
What choice did you have?
The choice that I had would be not taking Factor VIII for an everyday bleed, for instance. That could be treated with ice, for instance. It could be treated by elevating the joint that was bleeding. Very few bleeds, if any, are life-threatening. And so the choice is always there not to use the factor.
The companies say that their position in 1983 was reasonable given the amount of knowledge that was available at that time.
I use the analogy of standing on a train track with looking down and seeing a bend in the tracks, and you hear the whistle blowing, the land is starting to shake, and someone says, standing in the middle of the track, says, "I don't see any train." It was very obvious, I think.
It wasn't until February 1984 that manufacturers began to put warning labels on Factor VIII. Within a year, they were routinely pasteurizing the product to kill the AIDS virus, a process they say they developed as quickly as possible, though others claim they should have introduced it earlier.
When I found out I was positive, they asked me to bring Jan in, and I said...
Loras Goedken was diagnosed HIV positive just before Christmas 1985. Then, the doctors tested his wife.
I took her in January of '86, and they called me at the office and gave them the results of her test. And I just, I left the office, walked around the block 3 times, and I'd never been around that block downtown. Did a lot of crying, did a lot of kicking, and had to come home and tell her she was positive.
You told her?
Yeah. It was my place to tell her.
Why?
She was my wife. And I gave it to her.
The system in this country demands that if you're injured, somebody has to be at fault.
Duncan Barr hasn't lost a case in which he's defended Cutter Laboratories against charges of negligence.
And all that I'm saying is, in this instance, maybe we ought to take a good hard look at it and say, nobody was at fault. It's too bad, and it's terrible, and it's awful, but it's nobody's fault.
We are told as a nation that we have the safest system for supplying medicines, drugs, treatments to our people in the world.
If we've been told that, it's a lie. If it is the safest in the world, then it's not very safe at all.
Give them a garland instead of ashes, the mantle of praise instead of faint heart.
Tom Taylor died this past August.
They will all be called oaks of righteousness.
Among the mourners at his memorial service were friends who are hemophiliacs or parents of hemophiliacs who are dying of AIDS.
I feel deeply, and Tom felt deeply, that our lives were not in good hands at a crucial time.
This was just a tragic failure of the entire medical system.
We're saying do a congressional investigation or something so we can just know what actually happened. You know, I want to explain to my daughter what happened. I don't have an answer. You know, and I'd like to be able to give her the answer.
Bye, Todd.
Just last month, the National Haemophilia Foundation announced plans to seek compensation from the government and from private companies for hemophilia.